Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is John. I am the event coordinator here at Murder by the Book. And before we get into tonight's event with Michelle and Katharine, I just wanted to give a couple of store announcements, let everybody know what is going on with us. So we started doing in-store events again in January. So if you look at the Murder by the Book website, you'll see events are going to be listed as either in-store or virtual. As we've been saying, we're going to keep doing both. We love doing both. But if there's somebody coming through that you're super excited about and they're going to be in-store, it's super critical for us to have people pre-order books and show up. We're sort of trying to show publishers again that there's a need for both events, and the way that we're able to do that with the in-store stuff is with butts and seats and pre-sale books. So if somebody's coming through, even if you can't make it, pre-ordering a signed copy of the book is a huge help for us. We've got a lot of great stuff coming up on Saturday tomorrow. Claudia Gray is going to be at the store at 3 o'clock. She's going to be talking about her book, The Murder of Mr Wickham, which is a really great Jane Austen murder mystery pastiche. She was supposed to sign with us last month, but as some of you guys know, a couple of the staff members at the store came down with COVID basically the day before the event, so we had to postpone it. Everybody's doing better. We're all fine now. It was just a rough couple of weeks. So that's our next in-store event. Next week, we're super excited. We're going to be chatting with Tori Eldridge and Alma Katsu virtually on Tuesday. Next Wednesday, we're going to have Nora Murphy in conversation with Anna Downs. And then John David Mann is going to be in the store next Thursday. So definitely make sure you check out murderbooks.com to see all of the great stuff we've got coming up. Also wanted to mention tonight, while Michelle and Katharine are talking, if you have questions for them, either about this new books or their new books, their previous books, writing process, any of that stuff, please post your questions in the live chat on YouTube or the comments on Facebook, and we will get to them in just a little bit. Also wanted to mention that we do have signed book plates to go with Katharine's book, Last Call at the Nightingale. So if you haven't picked up a copy yet and you order from us, we will get you a signed book plate for that. Now I'm going to get us started. We're super excited to have Katharine Schellman here with us tonight. Let me bring her out. How are you tonight, Katharine?
I'm doing really well. How are you tonight?
Doing well, thanks. It's nice to meet you.
It's wonderful to meet you, and thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to get to have this little chat with Michelle.
Yeah, so Katharine's newest book, Last Call at the Nightingale, just came out on Tuesday. Both Brenda and I have read it. We're big fans. If you guys love historical mysteries, you were in for a treat. Katharine is a former actor, one-time political consultant, and current writer. Her debut novel, The Body in the Garden, was the Suspense Magazine Best Book of 2020 and led to her being named one of BookPage's 16 Women to Watch. The Body in the Garden actually just came out in paperback as well. A graduate of the College of William and Mary, Katharine currently lives in the mountains of Virginia in the company of her husband, children, and many houseplants she keeps accidentally murdering. And we're super excited tonight to also be joined by Michelle Gable. Let's bring Michelle out. How are you tonight, Michelle?
Good. How are you?
Doing well.
I didn't know you went to William and Mary? You went to William and Mary?
We both did.
I didn't know that about you. How funny.
I feel like I've suddenly discovered all these William and Mary alums who are writers now. It's like since I had my first book come out, there's a lot of them out there.
I know, me too. It's exciting. Well, we're very talented people coming out of William and Mary.
All overachievers.
Yes, exactly. Well, congratulations. I am so happy for you. It came out on Tuesday, right? So
yes,
brand new into the world. Did you do anything special on Tuesday?
Tuesday was pretty low key. We just had some friends over for dinner and had like some cake and champagne and kids running around and entertaining each other while the adults could have a little quiet time. But I had my first. Perfect. It was really nice. I had my first in-person event yesterday because my first book came out. The Body in the Garden came out in the beginning of April 2020, so it was right after everything shut down for the pandemic. So all of my in-person events got canceled, and then I had another book come out last summer, Silence in the Library. Everything was virtual for that too, and I'm so grateful to do all the virtual stuff. Like we wouldn't be having this conversation if we weren't doing things virtually, which is fantastic. But it was pretty exciting to do my first in-person event for a book yesterday.
Yeah, that's a huge deal. When John said your first book came out, I don't think I realized in 2020 that I'm like, oh, poor thing.
It was like 2 weeks after everything shut down.
Yeah. Well,
real quick,
sorry,
before you get, that's okay. Before we get in, I just wanted to officially introduce Michelle as well. So Michelle Gable's most recent book is The Bookseller's Secret. We're all big fans of all of Michelle's books. As we were talking about beforehand, she got to actually come to the store with us and sign when A Paris Apartment came out. So we've been following her career, and we're super excited about new book. Michelle is the New York Times bestselling author of A Paris Apartment, I'll See You in Paris, The Book of Summer, and The Summer I Met Jack. She also attended the College of William and Mary and spent 20 years working in finances before becoming a full-time writer. She grew up in San Diego and lives in Cardiff by the Sea, California. So as I mentioned, if you guys have questions tonight for either of them, you can post those in the comments. But for now, Michelle, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I will see you guys in just a little bit.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Again, congratulations. As you know, I absolutely loved your book. I blurbed it, but I'm going to read it just for everyone to hear, so you guys can get a taste of what this book is like if you haven't read it yet. I called it a sexy, fun romp through the jazz age with a well-plotted mystery and applause-worthy female characters. Readers will soak up this spellbinding read. So I just loved it. The reviews have been fantastic. So tell us, the first question everybody's going to have is, how'd you come up with the idea?
Ooh. This one, I wanted to write something that was completely different from what I'd done before. My first two books in the Lily Adler mysteries are set in Regency England. So it's basically Jane Austen time. Like, you think your favorite BBC like costume drama, but instead of everyone being worried about marriage, they're worried about murder. Like that's sort of the vibe those ones are in. But they're very traditional. They've got kind of a cozy vibe to them with the historical setting. And I wanted to do something that was, first of all, not set in England. I wanted to do something in the US.
Yes. You're like, something new.
Yes, definitely. because I love a good like British manor house murder mystery, obviously, because I write those. But it's a whole genre on its own. Like just murder mysteries in England. So I wanted to do something completely different. And if I was doing a different setting, I also wanted to do a different type of characters. I wanted to do someone who was not upper class. I wanted to focus on working class characters and poor characters. And I ended up just having this character, Vivian, the main character, just basically walk into my mind fully formed, just like this very
that's the best,
vivid personality. And I think when you have a character like that, where they live is such a huge part of who they are. So I knew instantly, like, oh, this is going to be a jazz age novel. It just took shape from there. It was a lot of fun to write.
Well, Vivian is a fantastic character. So tell me how you set about doing your research for this book.
My real only exposure to the jazz age was like reading The Great Gatsby in high school, which I think like everyone has to do at some point.
Right, exactly.
So I had a very clear picture of, just the broad outlines essentially of the jazz age and 1920s and prohibition. But it was very much focused on like, what everyone was doing on Long Island, like that sort of environment, that class of people.
That class.
Yes. So I had to do a lot of like big world building, like, okay, what was actually going on during prohibition? How did that affect like sort of culturally, socially, politically, what was going on? But then just a lot of really nitty gritty deep dives into, okay, if people were living in this section of New York, like who was in this section of New York versus this section. So it was lots of old maps, old subway lines, like old advertisements.
Exactly. Yeah.
Like the nice thing about the 1920s is there's still so much material to go through. Is
that what you found? You found a lot of good source material.
Yes, absolutely. And luckily there's lots of museums and archives putting things online, which makes it so much easier.
I know. The worst is when you're trying to find something and it's like, it's in this container.
Right. You're like, oh, it's in this container in this other country. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Far from you.
Yeah. So you found a pretty easy to access stuff.
I did, yes. And there's always, that one little detail. I'm sure you experienced this in your books where I cannot find this one thing and I'm just going to make it up. Like I'm gonna hope no one notices.
That's the line. That's the thing that's good about writing fiction. I think about even real situations is you can have that leeway. Many times I've been like, where was JFK this month? I'm like, you know what? He was in New York.
that's where he needed to be. So that's where he's going to be.
Yeah. Like if I can't find anything to disprove that. Did you find anything interesting tidbits in your research that didn't make it into the novel?
My favorite random one. So a lot of it was like weird ways that people would get around prohibition and find ways to still buy or sell alcohol.
Yeah.
Which it was a really weird time because there was so much illegal activity going on. That was a lot of people were just sort of turning a blind eye to. And one of the weirdest ones that I found was there's this company that called Vino Sano, and they would sell these bricks of dehydrated grape juice, and they'd ship them around the country. So it was like a full, like basically astronaut food, I guess, but like a brick of grape juice, like completely dried out. And it would arrive with instructions for what not to do to turn it into wine. And that was how they got around the law. They were saying, I love that. Do not turn this into wine. Do not follow
under no circumstances.
Yeah. And I love that. You can find advertisements for these things in newspapers from the 1920s. Like, it was completely blatant.
And where they just said it was grape juice, that's how they
they were selling grape juice. And they were warning you not to make it into wine.
Well, and as you point out in your author's note too, you could get medicinal alcohol, like from the pharmacy or whatever. And then I thought it was also interesting how you said a lot of the cops were in on on the speakeasy, well, maybe not necessarily speakeasies, but the bootlegging and things like that.
And there was a lot of bribes going on from the speakeasies in order to stay open and make sure that you didn't get on the wrong side of anyone who was either in politics.
I'm sure it was just constant. Well, that's how the Kennedys made all their money, the bootlegging and it was very lucrative if you were in the right position. I just loved how what's very interesting about your book because it is a murder mystery, there is a murder aspect. So that's very plot driven, but you had such a rich tapestry of people from different, walks of life and different ethnicities, different, sexualities, and you still developed them. Nobody was a caricature. So how did you balance the plot? Were you very conscientious of it, or did it come pretty naturally? You were very good about balancing the plot, but it was still very character driven.
I tend to think in characters first. I almost always start with who the people are, and that really informs where they have to live and what they're going to be doing. And then at some point, a dead body shows up, and given who this person is, how are they going to react to that?
Exactly.
So I think for me, since I really start with the characters, who they are and how they're going to behave in response to whatever happens in the plot is really what drives it forward. What about you? Do you tend to do character first or setting first?
Yeah, I would say I do characters and then setting. It depends on the book, but sometimes it's setting, sometimes it's character, and then it's kind of the plot. But so much of mine, the plot is what's the real part, JFK having an affair with this woman, or in The Bookseller's Secret, Nancy Mitford worked in this bookshop. So sometimes it's more of I'm having a plan, around.
And you deal with real people too, which that's a whole other layer.
Yeah, it's not. I keep swearing I'm not going to deal with real people one of these days, because even though it's fiction, you get bound up in wanting to make it so accurate that you're I just don't want it to be inaccurate. So more along the lines of, well, this could have happened. There's nothing that says it couldn't have, but
you don't want something that someone could point to be I know that didn't happen because on this day
he was dead.
Was happening.
Yeah, exactly. Has it been the same for all your books? Do you outline pretty thoroughly, or are you a little looser with your outline? What's your process? And is it different for each of your books?
It's gotten more consistent. This one was the first one I really outlined thoroughly. It was the second one I wrote, actually. I wrote this one while we were waiting to see if the first Lily Adler book would sell. And I needed something completely different to focus on. Yeah. The first Lily Adler book, I did not outline at all. And when I finished the first draft of that, I had 140,000 word mess. It was kind of a disaster because I hadn't had a plan. And as I discovered as I was writing it, when you're writing a mystery, you're trying to put in, your clues and your red herrings and
yes, you need all those. I think it would be so hard.
Yeah. Because the way I like to do it is I like to give readers the opportunity to solve it along with the characters. Some people don't want to read that way. They just want to read the book and then get the reveal at the end. And that's a great way to read. But some people really like to try and figure it out. So I want to make sure.
Oh, I think so. Yeah.
I like to try and figure it out while I'm reading.
Yeah. So I think a lot of mystery readers do. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you want the clues there. You want the sort of the progression that the sleuth goes through, but then also you want everything there that the reader can sort of figure it out on their own, maybe ahead of them if they put it all together. And so the first Lily-Adler book, I did not know how to do a good job at that because I'd never written a mystery before.
Yeah.
So it was like twice as many red herrings as I should have had and clues in the wrong place. And so I had to go back and do a lot of editing on that one to actually make it make sense. So this one, when I started writing it, I sat down and I wrote basically a scene by scene outline. I think the whole thing was somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 words by the time I was done with the outline, because it was just so detailed. Like it was almost like a first draft in itself. Like that was when I really hammered out the plot and hammered out what the character beats were going to be and all of that. So yeah, that one was very thoroughly outlined. This one was very thoroughly outlined. I think the ones after that were slightly less thoroughly outlined. I gave myself a little more wiggle room on those ones to have a little more of a discovery process because I felt a little more confident in getting from point A to point B.
Pull it off. Yeah. So you didn't veer too far from that initial 6,000 to 7,000 word outline.
It ended up being pretty similar in terms of plot beats. There were definitely character moments that still I discovered as I was writing, I would say.
Yeah, that always happens. This character wants more attention or whatever.
Yeah. Or that, this happened. And then you realize like, oh, if that happened, this person is going to maybe react a little differently than I had anticipated they would react.
Right. Exactly. Do you have a favorite character besides Vivian?
Honestly, and this is for anyone who has read it, which I think probably is mostly just you right now. But once you read it, you will realize this is a very strange thing because my two favorite characters are, other than Vivian, are probably Honor and Florence, who are the most opposite of each other. Because Honor,
yes, those are pretty much
Honor is this
in terms
very
of sympathetic,
glamorous.
In terms of
Honor is very glamorous and mysterious. She runs this speakeasy. She's an out lesbian woman in the 1920s. She plays her cards really close to her chest on anything personal or how she's interacting with anyone around her, and she really just like has her own little kingdom that she's created at her club. Whereas Florence is Vivian's older sister, and she's the rule follower. Like she does not go out, she does not drink, she does not dance, doesn't do anything illegal. She keeps her head down, she does her work, and she just kind of hopes that if she does that, things will get better in her life. And out of the two sisters, I'm probably a lot more of a Florence than a Vivian. I'm definitely more of a rule follower.
Yeah, you wouldn't be behind a speakeasy finding dead bodies.
Yeah. So I had a lot of sympathy for her as I was writing, which made it interesting to write the sister dynamic because they're so often butting heads. And the character whose head I was in was Vivian, my main character. And I would be like, oh no, she's treating her sister so badly.
Be nice. But it's good if you can get, because I mean, not that Florence is an unsympathetic character, but she's not as, it's good because she's just a little more rule abiding and a stickler, right? So it's good that you can have, that you can have like sympathy for her to really draw her out as a real person, not just like a caricature of, the opposing sister.
Right. I wanted her to feel like a real person and not just like the disapproving mother figure, essentially, who's telling you not to do stuff.
Yes, exactly. And just the other characters, did you that were like the bartender, like did you fill them in as you were writing, or did you have an idea of them beforehand? Just the ancillary characters that didn't play.
I think before I started outlining the four characters that I knew would be there. There was Vivian, the main character, Honor, the club owner, B, who is a waitress at the Nightingale at the Speakeasy, and she's a very close friend of Vivian's, and then Danny Chin, who's a bartender there.
I like Danny.
I love Danny.
Yeah,
I have so much love for all of my characters. It's really hard to pick a favorite one.
That's good.
But those were the four that I knew sort of who they were and what their role was in this world before I started writing. And then as I was outlining, that's when I sort of figured out who all the other characters were. That's when Leo, who's one of Vivian's sort of potential antagonists, potential love interests over the course of the book, appeared. And that's when I figured out who Florence was and what her relationship to Vivian was, and all of that. So a lot of the characters I really discovered in the process of outlining, but those 4 were sort of there from the beginning.
Well, it showed, because they felt very fleshed out, very, they really came alive on the page. Did you base any of your characters on real people, or were they all just kind of people that you could envision coming out of that era?
I'm trying to think if I don't think any of them were really based on real people. That's something I haven't really tried to tackle yet. So I'm very intimidated by the fact that you do. How is that balanced?
Well, you can fudge it, right? You can have somebody in my book that comes out this year, like I'm like, I can't do real person. It's based on someone, but I'm like, I'm changing the name. That way no one could be like, that way you just have more latitude to do whatever you want. And because I try to make it realistic. So yeah. Well, in that case, I can be like, well, it's not even that person. It's this whole other person that I made up. So
something like the booksellers,
totally different.
And something like the Bookseller's Secret, you had those 2 main characters. One of them was Nancy Mitford, and she's this real person. And then you also had Katie, who's your own invention. So what was that like? Like doing two very different source material, like one of your imagination, one's a real person.
Well, luckily, Nancy Mitford wrote like 8,000 letters in her lifetime. So her voice I took more latitude actually with her than I normally do with my real characters, just because there were, it takes place entirely during the war when she's working in this bookshop, and she didn't write a lot during that time, or the letters were lost or something. So I had more latitude. So I was a little more, but all my books are back and forth. So I kind of like the real person, and the made up one is just easier to do. Well, just the way my mind works is I want to be so precise, probably more so than I need to be.
It's kind of a point of pride once you've done all the research. Like you want to really do that person justice and really represent them well, or represent your world well, or the type of people who would have been there. But then there's always the point like, well, I'm just gonna do what I want with this.
Yeah, this would be much more expeditious for my plot. Did you do all your research before you started writing, or as you were doing it, or kind of how did you approach that? Because there's different approaches, right?
I think mine's a little bit of both. I tend to do a lot of big picture research before I start writing. So I get a sense of, if these people are living in this world at this time, what does that mean in terms of what they can and can't do, and what they will and won't see, and how they will interact with each other and with the other people around them, because that really shapes, I think, the plot and the conflict. So I get a lot of that big picture, like the social history and what's going on politically and where people are living in this environment and all of that. And that was really fun for this one, because pre-pandemic, I'd actually done a trip up to NYC with a friend, and we just spent a weekend walking around the city, visiting museums. Like we went to the Museum of, I'm going to get the name wrong. It's up in Harlem. So I think it's Museum of the Jazz Age up in Harlem. And we went to the Tenement Museum and Museum of Chinese in America, and but then also walked around the city to get a sense of, okay, if we're moving from point A to point B, what is that trek like?
Yes, I know that. I think that's so important, because sometimes you will have somebody walking, you're like, okay, they wouldn't do that in 10 minutes. That would take them an hour or whatever. So I think that's so important. You can't always walk the area. You can't always do that, but I think it's good when you have that opportunity.
Yeah, it was really nice to be able to do that, because for the Lily Adler books, which were set in England, I had to do a lot of Google Maps instead. So okay,
yes, and you're like putting a little person. You're like, how long is that walk? Oh yeah, I had to do that even though I'm very familiar with the Mayfair area in London and stuff. And I'd planned to go back, but because it's always a good excuse, writing, travel, like, oh, I have to go here. That's why my books are, that's why my books are always in nice places. But I definitely was like, I think you can walk this pretty quickly, but let me just check. So it is, people didn't have that back in the day. So at least, we have that piece of it.
But I also think I tend to do a lot of research as I'm writing too, but that tends to be more specific things, like, is there a subway line, or was there a subway line that would go along here? Like, would that take them where they needed to go? If
Right.
they were buying breakfast cereal at the grocery store, like what brands of breakfast cereal were being sold in the 1920s? Did they have breakfast cereal for sale in the 1920s?
Yeah, like what did they?
How did that work out? So a lot of little details like that. And that's when I tend to be really grateful for all the archivists and libraries that are putting things online now, because you can get that really quickly and not spend the whole day.
And you're smarter than I am, because it took me a long time to like balance that the pre stuff that, like you said, just having a framework of where they would be and what they would and wouldn't be doing, and then start, I would do all my research, and then you're like trying to cram these weird facts and I would get frustrated. I think it's much easier to, like you said, do it as you're going along. Like, okay, I need to know what they ate for breakfast, or I need to know this little tidbit. So you learn that quicker than me. It took me a few.
Like it's so hard not to cram all the weird facts in there, though. Like you find them out and you want to put them in.
I know. Like, and your editor's like, I'm not really sure what this is about. And you're like, look, I just want people to know about this. It's really interesting.
I wanted to put it in there.
They're like, why don't you just save that for like a talk you're doing?
Yeah.
Why don't you just, put it in the back? But it is hard, because I'm sure you have the same experience. I probably only use like 10% of what I research in the book, but you do need that framework of that, the vibe, the feeling, the everything, I think, to dive in. But I'm trying to get better at it.
Yeah, it informs everything. It gives you a really good framework to write out of, and to give you a lot of confidence in, especially in historical settings. Like, okay, this is, to the best of my understanding, what this would have been like in this time period. Even if the details don't make it in there, you still, like, I think you as a writer need that sense.
It's there. You know what those tiles looked like, and the this and the that. I was going to ask you something about the research. I completely forgot. Skip my mind. Maybe, hopefully I'll think of it again. In terms of your writing, do you tend to like do it in a concentrated time during the day? Do you have like a daily word count, a time that you spend? Is it kind of like whenever you can get it in? I know you have a young child, so that's not easy.
It depends on the day and how close to a deadline I am.
Well, yeah, there's that.
Yes.
How motivated are you?
Nothing will motivate you like a deadline.
Yeah, exactly.
I try to be, I do have young kids, and I try to get a lot of my writing done when they're at daycare. I have daycare 3 days a week, so I get a lot done then.
Oh, nice.
But I also, there's a lot of evenings and weekends where I'll try to get it done. I try not to parent and write at the same time, because I find that I don't focus so well. I get real tunnel vision when I'm writing. Like, I won't hear people talking to me.
Yeah.
And it's a little difficult with like a 5-year-old trying to ask you questions. But there's also times
I call it micro focusing, or like hyper focusing, like where you're just like, I'm doing this one thing right now, do not talk to me.
Like my brain does not hear anything else going on.
Yeah.
But I've also had times where you're like, oh, I've got copy edits to do. Like the baby is in the carrier and I'm doing my copy edits, or, I've got my computer open and I do a thing and I write a sentence, and then I go do a thing for my kid and I write another sentence. Like I try not to do that, but it sneaks in there sometimes. Mostly I try
sometimes you can't help it.
Mostly I try to have like my working hours.
Yeah, that's good. I mean, it's good to, in my opinion, that's not always feasible, but for me, that definitely helps. And even I have older kids, and that I'm even like, please do not just like barge in and stuff into my office and start talking at me. Like, because when you're in the middle of something, sometimes, especially if you're really in the groove, like to pull out, it's so hard to get back in. Like sometimes just getting in is the hardest thing. Like,
right. And you're like, okay, I'm in my zone. I've got the voice of the narrator or the voice of the character in my head. I'm working on this. I'm figuring out exactly what I need to say. And as soon as you're interrupted, it's gone.
Exactly. And then you're like, okay, can we talk about this huge long thing later? So, and I'm trying to think, my kids were a bit older than yours when I first started, having published books. So I didn't have to quite deal with the young thing, just more the driving them everywhere and, being in
around
and the warm ups, or like writing books at softball fields or whatever. So I've had that piece of it. Now I remember the research question I wanted to ask you. Do you do anything to get yourself like in the mood for that time period. Like sometimes, like when I had a book set in the 70s, I would I watched a lot of Mary Tyler Moore. Like, did you listen to any jazz music or do anything external, or not really?
I ended up listening to a lot of music for this one, especially because so much of it does happen at a speakeasy. I listen to a lot of jazz music, a lot of Charleston, and different dance music, and we actually put together a playlist for the book.
Oh, fun! Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
Yeah. So it's linked on my website. There's a I think you can search on Spotify. I think if you just search Last Call at the Nightingale, there's a playlist that comes up. But if you go to my website, there's also like in the book club guide, it has a little QR code that you can scan to pull up the playlist.
Oh my gosh,
which is
brilliant.
Probably the 10 songs that like I listened to the most when I was writing.
So it's not even just like random jazz songs; it's like the ones you listen to, right?
Yeah, the ones I listen to, and a lot of them get name checked in the book.
I love that. That's so amazing. I think that's just a nice little touch.
But for me, it always has to be like the hype up, though. Like I can't listen to music while I write; it's too distracting for me. I like need silence and just me and the computer.
Sometimes I'll play like symphony music if I need to,
ambient.
If there's too much activity in my house or whatever, and I'm like, I need to tune it out, especially like during COVID when everybody was home, I would be like, okay. But unlike you, I can't really listen. Like I'll try to get in the mood with the book I'm writing now, set in the 60s, and I try to get in the mood with some 60s music, and I tried to write with it, but I'm like, I can't. It's too distracting.
Anything with words, I can't do this. Like I'm doing the words. I can't have something else doing words at the same time.
Exactly. I'm the same way. So I read that this is the first installment of a series. So this is going to be a series.
It is, yes, which was weird because when I wrote it, I thought it was going to be a standalone. So I didn't have like a, what happens next sort of in mind. So,
and it reads like a standalone, like it very much does.
I wanted to end it like in a place that felt kind of wrapped up. But when my agent and I were pitching it, she said, if a publisher wanted it as a series, would you do that? And I was like, yes, of course.
Yes. No, I will not. They want me to do multiple books? No, thank you. Yeah. So of course you will.
If you want to say it has like series potential, like, yes, I'm on board with that. But I didn't have anything in mind. I didn't have anything planned out. So she had me just write up a quick little, essentially back cover of a book copy of like, if you were going to do a next book, just give me a plot idea, basically. So I just wrote something really fast, and that was what Minotaur, my publisher, ended up buying. Is they bought 2 books with like the potential for more down the road. So now I had to come up with a plot and write a second book that I hadn't been planning to write, and now I have to come up with a plot for a third one. So,
oh my gosh, is it going to have the same characters or?
Yes, it's still going to follow these same characters. So I actually just finished writing the second one.
Oh, congratulations.
Thank you. Yes, that was probably, I think that would have been the 5th book I've written now. And like the 5th of like my published books. I have all like the really bad books that I wrote for, a decade and a half before that.
We all have those. Yeah.
They were so terrible. Like,
we have,
they're very good practice. But since The Body in the Garden, since the first Lily Adler mystery, I think this was, so the one I just finished was my 5th one that I wrote. Okay. And it was probably the hardest one out of all of them to write because
was it?
I hadn't planned to write it. Like I hadn't planned for it to be a series. And I'm so glad it is. Like going back and revisiting those characters was so much fun. And like getting back in that world and figuring out like, okay, if all this happened in the first one, what does that mean for these characters going forward? Like, what are their relationships with each other now? What are their relationships with their world and their careers and with where they live and where they work and all of that? So that was so much fun. I loved the result, but the writing process was very hard.
Oh my gosh. Well, does it skip ahead? How far ahead in time does it skip, or not very far?
Not super. It's later the same year.
Okay. So just a few months down the road. Well, that's exciting.
Yeah. So
now are you, nice. Are you also, now you're planning a third one in that same series?
I'm hoping that there will be a third one in that series now, but I have to come up with an idea for it first.
I'm sure you will. I'm sure you will come up with something great. That's exciting. And are you done with the Lily Adler mysteries? Was that a set thing? Are you still writing those as well?
The third Lily Adler mystery is coming out in August, and then there's going to
wow,
be,
busy year for you.
Yes, I did not plan on having 2 books come out this year.
And the paperback of
yes, and the paperback also. I feel a little bad for my paperback because it hasn't gotten as much attention.
It happens.
But yeah, so there's the third one's coming out this year, and then the fourth one, there's 2 more on the schedule for that one. So in
oh my gosh,
2023 and 24, it's when those ones are planned to come out. So I'm writing the 4th Lily Adler now, which
oh my gosh, busy.
Although I think nothing will be weirder than writing the 3rd one, because I was writing it while I was pregnant with my daughter last summer.
Oh my gosh.
So I had my deadline for when it was due to my editor, but her due date was 2 weeks before my deadline.
Yeah,
so
you're like, no.
I was having all these like stress dreams while I was writing while I was pregnant that I had to email my editor and say, well, here's the book so far. I'm in labor. I'll talk to you in a few months.
Yeah, good luck with this. But they're usually pretty. I mean, even with my, it was a bookseller's secret. I mean, she wanted it by a certain date, and I wasn't even close. It was kind of a mess. And I wrote it, like, I signed the contract during COVID. I wrote it during COVID, so it was due. Like, it was a pretty quick turnaround.
And I just gave her this.
Yeah. We like sold the book and we sold it on a proposal, so it was, I had to write the thing. We sold it in March 2020, and it was due in like August or something like that. Like, I agreed to something I should not have agreed to. I knew I was going to do that. But anyway, I'm like, sure. And then we kind of pushed it a few, and she's like, oh, just give me what you have. I'm like, all right, here you go. Like, here's some big old mess.
Well, and that's the nice thing about the editor is there to help you fix the mess. Like, that's definitely.
I know, she did. She did some heavy lifting on that one.
For.
Yeah. Is it hard for you to go back and forth between the different mystery series, or not really? You can. I mean, I assume you just do one at a time. You're not working on both.
Yeah, I tend to. Sometimes I'll have. In the last year, it's happened that I've been drafting one and also had like edits come back for the other one.
Right. That's a little bit different. Yeah.
But I'm not trying to draft them at the same time. I think the fact that they are so different from each other, just sort of the tone of them and the vibe and the setting, and it's also very different. That I never sort of get confused about which voice I'm writing in when I go back and forth between them, which makes it a lot easier.
I mean, it would be weird if you did, right, in those 2 settings. Yeah. So I guess that makes it easier because I just think it would be so hard to switch back and forth. But I guess if you're doing it in a more discreet manner, that you would. Yeah. Well, I'm very impressed that you're.
I don't think I could draft it at the same time. I think that would just like melt my brain to try to.
Yes.
Try to go back and forth that way.
And then you feel like you're getting momentum on one, and then not the other, and then it's like. I definitely feel like I need to be all in on one. And sometimes it's even hard for me to get the edits back or whatever on another one because I get so deep. But mine are more closely, because you're a mystery. They're 2 different continents, 2 different.
You've dealt with a lot of like similar time periods across yours. So I could imagine that like going back between the different characters, but that are living in sort of that same social setting or the same world events happening at the same time. That would be really
I mix up their names so much. I mean, I don't know if you ever do that, but I'm like, oh God. And then my main character, Nancy Mitford, and in the book that's coming out this year, her name is Nikki, and so it's 2 N names, and I can't.
Oh no.
And sometimes I'm like, who am I writing about? Especially if I was getting like edits back or whatever, because as you know, you have to go back to the other stuff, along the way, copy edits, regular edits, all that kind of stuff. So it was like, wait, Nikki, Nancy, like I can't.
Which one?
And then sometimes it just comes out of my head.
Did you ever find that you put the wrong character in when you were writing?
Oh, for sure. And then I was like, what I really need to do too. And I'm always worried that I'm going to reuse a character name because like I forget, so I'm like, I should really keep a spreadsheet of all my characters because, and then also if I do a book thing and people will ask, like if, I wrote Paris of Parliament like 10 years ago, and sometimes people still read that book a lot. And sometimes you'll be like, what about this character? And I'm like, I honestly have no idea who you're talking about. They'll like say some minor, like someone's like Birdie. I'm like, who is Birdie? I have no idea who you're talking about.
I haven't thought about Birdie in 10 years.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't even know who that is. It doesn't sound like a name I would use, but I'll take your word for it. I'm like, oh yeah, she's great. I don't know. So I need to, I'm like, God, at a certain point, I mean, luckily you have some of the same world, right, and characters, but
having the characters continue and not having to come up with new ones has definitely been helpful so far. Although I realize in the Lily books in particular, I have to be careful about reusing names because, if you read like a Jane Austen book, it feels like every other character is named John, right? So, right. or
because they probably were all named,
right? Like there's not so I've ended up with like 5 different Johns in different contexts, and at one point I was like, do I need to? And my editor said, no, I feel like that's accurate. It's historically accurate, so just stick with it.
It is,
as long as you don't.
It is hard
to between them. It's probably okay.
Right. Yeah. I know. And I try to even just do different enough names that it's like you don't in the same one, but that doesn't even always work. And then, you know how that goes. Well, I'm so happy for you. And I'm excited there's going to be another Vivian tale. Did you have any other things you wanted to hit? Should we see if John has questions?
Yeah, let's see if there's any questions that folks have, and I'll make sure we have time to answer.
Perfect. Okay, so before we get into questions, I know that we have talked a little bit about Michelle's book, The Bookseller's Secret. But Michelle, do you want to tell everybody a little bit, kind of the elevator pitch for the book?
Oh, sure. It takes place, it's a dual time period. And in the modern day, there's a struggling writer. I will say she has some frustrations that I've had in my past. And she is struggling in her personal life. She's struggling with her writing. She can't figure out what to write next. And she goes to visit her friend who lives in London, just to kind of get away from things and get some inspiration. And she stumbles into the Haywood Hill bookshop, which is in Mayfair. It's a real bookshop. And that's where Nancy Mitford worked during the war. And Nancy Mitford is the most fascinating person. I've always loved her writing. I just love her. Her writing is incredibly modern and funny, and she has like just tons of personality. And she came from this, I find a lot of people in the US actually aren't that familiar with her, which is shocking to me because everybody should know Nancy Mitford, but she came from this aristocratic family that was, they had titles, but they had like no money, which is why she was working in a bookshop like during the Blitz. She literally needed the money. She wasn't just trying to, do something fun. And she was a writer. And at that point she had written 4 books. And it was kind of funny because at that point when I was writing this book, I'd written 4 books. This was my 5th. And so I just took off from there. And she has also a fascinating family, like her sisters. One sister was a socialist, one sister was a Nazi, one sister was a communist. And her mom said like and there was always just insane stories. There was a duchess, of this, of that. And the mom's like, every time she would see in the newspaper, like the headline, Pierre's daughter, ... She's like, okay, which one of my daughters did this next? Like one was one of Hitler's confidants, like they were very good friends. So, and then you have the communists, and it was just a crazy, crazy situation. So I'd always wanted to write something about Nancy Mitford, and I didn't really ever know what, because I read the book, The Sisters, and that came out like in 2001, and it was nonfiction about these sisters. I'm like, okay, I got to set something here. And I love the drafty old estate, the drafty old mansion and all that kind of stuff. And that trying to keep up appearances when you don't have any money. And her father was always making bad business investments. So you go back in time, she worked there, and the modern day character Katie discovers that there might be a manuscript that Nancy wrote that never published. And so she's kind of trying to poke around and figure that out. And in the meantime, there's a love interest, and she's trying to revive her career. And then Nancy is trying to figure out her career, because she's had 4 books, but she doesn't consider herself like she's not a success. Her books didn't sell that much. And like her most recent book was like this light romp, but it came out like the day that, England went to war. And so nobody wanted to read about like, rich people doing rich people things. So it's about, and, she had a lot of struggles, and she also was trying to compete in a man's world. She was friends with a lot of male writers, and, they would go to war, and they would get to like take 6 months off from war and still get paid to write books. And then they go back to war. She's like, how is this fair? So it goes back and forth between the, early 40s and modern day.
Perfect. All right. So Callie wants to know, Katharine, she says, so you've written 2 books in completely different time periods. Is there any other time period that you're thinking you would potentially want to do? Is there another one that you're like itching to write about, or are you good with what you're working on now?
I don't know. I think I'm having so much fun with the time periods I'm in right now. I think if I were going to branch out and do something different, it would probably just be a completely different genre. I think I would either do something sort of contemporary, or I would do something that's sort of like maybe branch out into fantasy or branch out into romance. I think I'd want to do something that's just that's a lot more a lot different. Not just like a different time period, but maybe even a different type of setting, a different type of genre, and explore it that way. But I think if I were going to do a different time period, it probably would be contemporary, but I'm not sure I could write a contemporary mystery, because then you have to have a lot of computers and science, and I'm not sure I want to do that.
How about you, Michelle? Is there any time period that you haven't tackled yet that you're itching to get to?
There's a lot. I've also thought about contemporary as well. So I was like, okay, for my book that is coming out. No, this one is a World War. I'm like, after this, no more World War II books. Like, I need to do something. So the one I'm working on now, it takes place in the 60s. So I'm like, okay, I'm creeping up. I'm like, okay, I want to do 70s. My publisher was like, well, and this was the second book of my 2-book deal. Mm-hmm. Oh no, wait, this was a new deal that we did. Sorry. It all blends together. But they're like, we don't really like 70s. We prefer 60s. I'm like, okay, well, this person that it's based on also was present in the 70s or in the 60s. So I'm like, okay, I can do that. So kind of creeping up. And like you said, I wouldn't mind doing contemporary, but I always like to do anything that makes me do research, but then I could do that for, a person's job in a contemporary setting or whatever the situation is.
Yeah. There'll always be something you don't know enough about.
Exactly.
And so, Katharine, so you said that, I think it's fascinating that you had written Last Call at the Nightingale before the Lily Adler books, and then you've done 2 Lily. So do you think working on the 2 Lily books, do you think that that's helped with the potential plotting for what this new series is going to be?
I think the more that you figure out, the more experience you have figuring out how to make a plot hold together, it doesn't become easy, but it becomes easier to fix all your mistakes, I think.
Right. You can self-diagnose that something's wrong. Somebody doesn't have to tell you. You can tell yourself that.
Right. Or even if you aren't sure how to fix it, you can look at it and say, okay, I can see where the problem is. Like, I can look at this and say, moving from this scene to that scene, or like what is happening with this character, like this is not holding together, or maybe these things are happening in the wrong order. And so it makes it easier, like you said, to self-diagnose where things aren't working. Like, I think in the first draft, it's always a mess, basically, no matter what you do. Like, you're sort of throwing plot and characters on the page and just trying to get it all down. When I write, I don't edit as I write. I can't really go back and do that because I lose momentum. I get so focused on editing. I'll end up doing like word by word line edits, and then I don't get the draft done. So I have to just write until I have the whole book down. And I always tell myself, you can't edit if it's not on the page. So as long as it's there, it doesn't matter if it's a mess. I'll go back and fix it later. But I've definitely,
and I think that's really smart. Like that I tend to go back and edit as I'm going, and it does trip you up. And who knows, you may completely delete that whole section later when you get down the road. So I'm trying to do more just like going forward and not worrying about yesterday, even if I know, like, okay, that is very problematic for this reason. So I'm trying to, I think you're smart to do it that way.
Their system that works for them though, right? Like, maybe you find that if you haven't fixed the thing from the day before, you can't focus enough on what comes next. Like, you have to get your characters in the right place to move them forward. So I think, everyone has their own system for how they get through just getting that first draft down.
So Michelle, have you been tempted, your books are standalones, have you been tempted to try your hand at a series?
I've thought about it. I don't read a lot of series, so I tend to be like, well, if I don't read a lot, then I shouldn't write that. I mean, people have asked a lot about a Paris Apartment series. I mean, I would be open to it, but I've never thought about it. I mean, I've thought about it in the highest of levels, not as in but like, oh, well, could I do this? Would I like to do this? What would it be, a mystery series or a different kind of series? Or would I rather do like a, those series that are like everybody's in the same world. So it might be this person's the star of this book and then their friend is the star of the next, I'm like, but I don't really have a setting or an idea. I would be open to it, but I don't read a lot of series. So I don't know, that's intimidating for me.
Katharine, one of the things that I loved about Last Call at the Nightingale is, as you mentioned, you have this character Honor who was an out lesbian at this time period. And I feel like a lot of times when authors tackle writing queer characters in history, it's all like doom and gloom. Their life is so hard. Clearly it was the past. Everything has to be terrible. And I thought that you did a really good job of being able to make her a full character who has like joy in her life. And then there are also some moments where you touch on the fact that, like, yes, being an out queer person in the 20s, there were issues. I thought you did a really good job of balancing that and making sure that you kind of got both of those in there. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Well, thank you. I'm glad it came across that way, because I think the 1920s was a really interesting time period to be writing about queer characters and queer people, because there was such a thriving subculture in cities, because there was this very illegal nightlife that was so it was underground, but everyone knew about it. So it really provided a space for a lot of queer culture to really grow and thrive in cities. In New York, there were these events called civic and masquerade balls throughout the 20s, and they were essentially these giant drag balls that would have thousands of guests at a single event. And it would be, there would be the people who were attending in drag or people who were queer, but then there would also just be people coming because that was the event to go to that night, and they'd just get dressed up and go out. So the fact that it was this sort of secondary world that was very separate from what people were doing with their everyday lives really allowed that culture to thrive, and gave queer folks a really, I don't necessarily want to say a safe space, because it wasn't necessarily safe. There was a lot about that world that was very dangerous. And then when you add on being queer on top of that, that's a whole other level of danger. But it allowed those communities to form and allowed them to thrive. And there were these very supportive communities and enclaves where like in Greenwich Village, for example, there was a huge community of queer folks living there, and just all sort of supporting each other. And that people knew that was where those communities were putting down roots. And it wasn't necessarily something that people would be accepting of, but it was also, there was so much social upheaval during that time, and there were so many new ways of expressing yourself for women and for queer folks in particular that were becoming socially common, if not socially acceptable. That it created a lot of opportunities for people to be living their lives a little more openly in certain contexts. And so exploring that was a lot of fun. And it was nice to set the book in an environment where I could explore that in the positive way, even if I did have to acknowledge that, okay, if Honor were walking around, being fully open and out as herself, just down the street in the middle of the day, like that might not have gone so well for her.
And it was a very thriving community in Paris as well during the Jazz Age. I was thinking about setting a book in Paris during the Jazz Age, and I wrote a good chunk of it. But it was very, it was shocking how it was, clubs, and it was and people were pretty accepting of it in Paris in general. It was like
there was such a I think particularly in the interwar period after World War I, because people were so devastated after World War I and after all the destruction during that war, that there was very much this like, let's just do all the things we've never done before. Let's go out there. We're going to party. We're going to drink.
Live your life. Yeah.
We're going to do it all. And there was a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot of acceptance, but a much higher degree of acceptance of like, you're doing you right now because
yeah, exactly.
50% of the people we knew died in the last 10 years, and we could die tomorrow. So let's just go for it.
Yeah. You do whatever you want. It's fine.
Yeah. So Susan wants to know, we'll start with Katharine for this one. Who are some of the writers that have influenced you?
Oh man, that is a long list. In terms of mysteries, I would say probably, I'm going to be a big old cliche here, and I'm going to say Agatha Christie was a big influence because I grew up watching like all the old masterpiece theater, like Poirot and Miss Marple with my parents. And at some point they said, like, these are books too. And they handed those to me, and I started reading those. And I discovered a lot of like the children's detective fiction that was written, and that, my parents had read when they were growing up. And so they gave me to read, and then, that really grew from there. I think at some point I discovered like, oh, people are still writing these. This isn't just stuff that was written when my parents were growing up. So that's just their reference point. Yeah. That was really exciting too. In terms of people writing historical mysteries today, whose work that I really love. Sherry Thomas, I think, is fantastic. She writes the Lady Sherlock mysteries, which are probably the best Sherlock Holmes reimagining that I think I've ever read. They're so much fun because it's a female Sherlock Holmes, but she's pretending to be the sister of the real Sherlock Holmes, who is fake, so that she can be a woman being a detective in Victorian London. And then, I love that. Yeah, it's a great premise. It's so much fun. Deanna Raybourn, who writes the Veronica Speedwell mysteries, she does phenomenal stories, and her characters are they're just wild. They're so much fun to read. Greer McAllister, I think, she's very interesting because she doesn't write series. She tends to write standalone mysteries and standalone crime fiction that's set in, very different historical settings. So those are the three that I read just a ton of. Like anything that they publish, I pick up.
How about you, Michelle?
Well, my first, like growing up, I've always loved Nancy Mitford, who I mentioned. Growing up, like my first, author that I was like, oh, I have to read everything. Well, aside from Sweet Valley High stories, okay, I read all this. So Francine Pascal was John Irving. I loved all his books. I remember reading A Prayer for Owen Meany and just being like, oh my gosh, like maybe I want to be. And I'd always been writing on the side, and I've always been a big reader, but that just really affected me. And in terms of the people now, like I love Kate Quinn, who's actually a good friend of mine. Sue Meissner, she's another good friend of mine. Beatrice Williams, Stephanie Dray, and Laura Camoy. Who else? Like I love when there's new. Who did I read recently? There was a new one that came out that was On Gin Lane. I can't even remember the author's name. I think it was a debut, or maybe it was her second book. Like I also love supporting new books that come out, like totally new authors to me, in addition to these ones that are auto buys for me. And then I do read a ton of contemporary fiction as well, like Emma Straub and, other people, Kevin, what's his last name? Kevin Wilson. I love his books. Nothing to See Here. That's hilarious. I just read that book, Lessons in Chemistry, by Bonnie Gamis, I think her last name is. So good. It's her debut, and she's 65 years old. It's her debut novel. It's the best book I've read so far this year. So I try to read pretty widely, and I read mysteries. I try to read a bunch of different genres, not just historical fiction.
I think reading across genres is so good as a writer. You learn so many things from the way other writers do things in completely different genres. One of my favorite genres to read is fantasy series, because I think fantasy authors do some of the best world building out there. So whenever I'm doing historical world building, like that's where I'm taking my lessons in terms of here's when you give people information, here's when you give them explicit information about this world, here's when you maybe hint at something, but you don't quite explain it. Like it's a master class. And I think reading across genres is one of the best things that you can do as a writer, but probably also as a reader, because you'll always end up finding something that you didn't expect to love.
I agree.
Yeah, it's fun. One of the things that I've discovered, I guess, probably in the last 6 or 9 months, is as I was slowly starting to get burnt out on mysteries, I started reading more romance, both historical, like Amanda Collins, who blends the mystery and romance together, or even just like the kind of paranormal rom-coms that are kind of popping up everywhere. And it's really fun to get to see, like, to start learning all of those tropes of the different genres and see how like different genres tell stories. It's
Yes.
As a reader, it's really fun to kind of get to. It's like you're learning like to read it all over again for the first time.
And there's so many good romances being published right now.
Oh my gosh, there really are. And then you can just be like, well, I'm reading all day, but I'm working. Okay, guys, I'm working. So don't bother me. I'm working.
Exactly. All right. So before we head out tonight, we've been talking about your book, most recent projects, and we've mentioned upcoming stuff. But do you want to remind everybody what you've got coming up next? Let's start with Katharine.
Sure. The next thing I think I have coming up very next is in August, the third Lily Adler mystery will be published. August 9th, it's Death at the Manor. And this one is a little bit of a different vibe. It's still got that cozy historical mystery vibe, but it's got a little bit of a gothic undertone, and like there might be a ghost involved. So it was a lot of fun to write. It's not something just in time for the fall and for Halloween.
Perfect.
I love gothic. That's exciting.
Mm-hmm.
I can't wait for that. My book is called The Lipstick Bureau, and it comes out in December, which is, I've never had a December book, so that's new for me. And it takes place in Rome at the end of the war, after Rome was liberated, but before the war was over. And it's about real people, but here's where I, change their names so I can be more liberal with what I did. And it's about these women that worked in Rome. During that time, they worked for morale operations for the OSS, which was the precursor to CIA. And basically their job was to pump out fake propaganda to send to the Nazi troops, basically trying to get them to lower their morale and give up and things like that. So it appeared to come from Nazi, publications or German publications, but it was really American made. And so it's about the effect of propaganda, like not just on the people receiving it, but the people making it, some relevance to today. But so it's, and then there's, that's Rome at the end of the war in December.
That sounds so cool.
Mm-hmm. All right, so that's going to do it for this evening. But before we head out, just to recap for anyone who might have joined us late, we've been talking with Katharine Schellman, whose newest book, Last Call at the Nightingale, just came out on Tuesday, and we've got signed book plates to go with our copies. And we've been chatting with Michelle Gable, whose most recent release is The Bookseller's Secret. If you missed any part of our chat, once we're done, Facebook and YouTube will archive it, so you'll be able to go back and catch up on anything you missed. And while you're on the YouTube channel, you can check out any of the other virtual events that we have done in the last couple of years. Michelle, it was so great to see you again. And Katharine, it was so great to be.
It's good to see you too.
Thank you so much for
having us. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank you. Congratulations. I'm so happy for you.
Thank you. Y'all have a great night. Thanks for tuning in.
You too. Take care.